Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 101 material. This is a brief lecture on epistemology, which introduces us to a major area of philosophical importance. Epistemology has a number of concerns that overlap quite nicely with other fields like cognitive science and psychology. And so epistemology really has a long storied history in philosophy, and as hopefully is clear from the assigned reading, a lot of epistemological problems have been thought about and studied for a long time by Western philosophers, Eastern philosophers, and many, many other people. So epistemology certainly occupies a central place in the history of philosophy. So please be sure to give the reading a go first before watching this lecture. I know that there are a lot of terms in the reading, but I think the article that was assigned does a really nice job of giving us a lay of the land, so to speak, concerning what are the main problems and issues within epistemology. So first, let's start by giving a brief overview of some of the terms that were outlined and defined in the article, and hopefully make things a little bit clearer on what the overall goals of epistemology are, and again, some of the issues that are investigated by epistemologists and philosophers more generally. So one thing that we'll realize is that epistemology covers quite a bit of material, but ultimately the goal for epistemology is to study knowledge. And it's certainly the case that we think we have lots of knowledge. I am sure that you have knowledge that I don't have, and vice versa. But I think we all assume that we have knowledge about various things, whether it's about mathematics or science or geography or certain kinds of experiences. Humans love to say that they know things. And so epistemology is ultimately in the business of figuring out what exactly that means and entails. What does it mean to say that we know something? And what are the justifications and conditions to have knowledge? So again, hopefully it's clear why this overlaps with psychology, because it really concerns human reasoning and the kinds of, again, justifications that are required to say that we actually have knowledge. So we'll start by talking about various kinds of knowledge we might have. And then in the second section, we'll talk about perhaps the most infamous account of knowledge called the JTB, or Justified True Belief account of knowledge, which has been widely discussed in the philosophical literature. Then we'll talk about what we mean by justification. And in the fourth section, we'll talk about various kinds of skepticism, and then talk about some major contributions to epistemology from historical philosophers. Okay, so as we mentioned, epistemology is the study of knowledge and the conditions for knowledge. So we can go into a little bit more depth on what epistemology is. So the word comes from the Greek episteme, which is study of knowledge, and justified belief. Epistemology is also fundamentally concerned with the nature of knowledge. So what do we mean by knowledge? What is knowledge? In other words, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge? So necessary conditions are the kinds of things that need to be there in order for us to have knowledge, versus sufficient conditions, which means something like, what are the things that lead to knowledge that if they're there, then we can say we have knowledge. They're sufficient to claim that we have knowledge. So those are fundamental questions concerning the nature of what knowledge is. Another fundamental concern of epistemology is the sources of knowledge. Again, we all claim to have knowledge about various things. So then a natural philosophical question is, where and how do we come to know things? Where does our knowledge come from? And also the scope of knowledge. What can we know? Can we know anything at all? Are there limits to human knowledge? And how can we identify those limits? So epistemology is fundamentally concerned with the scope of human knowledge as well. So certainly three major areas within epistemology that have defined the subfield for millennia now. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about kinds of knowledge. So the article mentions hopefully rather intuitive kinds of knowledge that most of us would agree that we have. So we can separate those various kinds of things that we know based on what they are. So most of us have what we call procedural and acquaintance knowledge. So when we talk about knowledge of that sort, we talk about knowledge of how or who. So for example, I think most of us would say, I know how to drive, or I know who Sophie is. That would be acquaintance knowledge. So most of us would claim to know how to ride a bicycle or know how to cook. Now, not everybody has, obviously, the same procedural knowledge. There are lots of things that many people know how to do that I might not be good at or know how to do at all. So I'm thinking I'm a really bad skier. I've skied a few times in my life, but I'm really bad at it. So I wouldn't really claim to know how to ski, or at least how to ski well. Or swimming, right? I still have a few friends who don't know how to swim. So that would be a kind of procedural knowledge that they may not have. And acquaintance knowledge is, as hopefully is obvious, knowing someone, right? So if I say, I know who Sophie is, Sophie is my cat, again, I think I know her, I'm acquainted with her, so I know who she is. Now, obviously not everybody knows who she is, so they wouldn't have that acquaintance knowledge. Now, in epistemology, we're typically not concerned with this kind of knowledge because it can, we think, very easily be explained by experience and even evolutionary psychology. And we, I think, take it for granted that when people say that they know somebody, we really don't have any reason to doubt that they know who that person is, right? So if you say you know somebody who I don't know, that's really probably not going to be a cause for concern or any cause for disagreement, right? Or even procedural knowledge. That might be a little more complicated. Obviously, some people claim to know how to do things and they really don't know how to do it, but typically we don't have the same kinds of disagreements with procedural and acquaintance knowledge that we do with what epistemology is ultimately concerned with, and that is propositional knowledge. And propositional knowledge is descriptive or declarative. And this is the kind of knowledge that something is the case. This is the kind of stuff that we think we study in school, we get from books, we get from learning new fields, things that concern declarative sentences. I know that it is going to rain, or I know that Earth is the third planet from the sun, or I know that 2 + 2 = 4. That's propositional knowledge because it's a proposition, which, as we know from our logic material, is any assertion or statement that something is the case. Now, obviously, the claim, I know that God exists, is also a case of propositional knowledge because it's a declarative statement. And there's going to be a lot more disagreement about this, right? We can think of even more complex examples or more, shall we say, controversial examples that people really ultimately disagree with, right? I know what the ultimate nature of the universe is. That's going to be a very controversial claim, but nonetheless, it's propositional knowledge. People are going to disagree with that, perhaps more vehemently than they will procedural and acquaintance knowledge. So philosophy has been focused, and epistemology more specifically, has been focused on the nature of and justification for propositional knowledge. Okay, so let's say a little bit more about what I mentioned before, necessary and sufficient conditions. So let's define a necessary condition, because these conditions are very important for not only epistemology, but other fields within philosophy and even fields outside of philosophy, like legal contexts and even computer science and logic and things like that. So a necessary condition for something, for some state of affairs, call it S, is a condition that must be satisfied in order for S to obtain. To put it differently, it is impossible to have S without having the necessary condition. So in other words, the inference that we're making, the reasoning process that we utilize when we talk about necessary conditions are essentially, if that necessary condition is not there, then no S, okay? So there's lots of examples of necessary conditions that I think are relatively intuitive. So here's an example. Being 35 or older is a necessary condition for being US president. What does that mean? Well, if you're not at least 35 or older, according to the US Constitution, you can't be president. Now, that could change, right? We could amend the US Constitution, but being at least 35 or older is a necessary condition for being US president. Being 21 or older is a necessary condition to legally purchase alcohol in the United States. Or being at least 18 or older is a necessary condition for voting. Now that's that age, there's a good example of something that's changed, right? But as of now, you have to be at least 18 or older to vote. Now, is being 18 or older a sufficient condition to vote? No, as we'll talk about. There are lots of people who are at least 18 or older who can't vote. This is a political conversation in some respects, right? There's some conversations about re-enfranchising people who have been convicted of felonies. And also non-US citizens can't vote for various reasons. So it's not a sufficient condition, but it's certainly a necessary condition. You have to be at least 18 or older to vote. There's also other examples that we can think of, like breathing oxygen is a necessary condition for humans to live. In other words, without oxygen, we can't live, right? It's a necessary condition. Contrast that with sufficient conditions. So a sufficient condition for some state of affairs, call it S, is a condition that, if satisfied, guarantees that S obtains. So the inference here that we draw is, if sufficient condition is present, then S follows. So here's an example. Stepping on Sophie, my cat's tail, is a sufficient condition for making her yelp or meow, right? There are lots of other reasons that Sophie, my cat, meows, just like I'm sure your cat or dog meows or barks, depending on a couple of different things, but certainly it's a sufficient condition that if I stepped on her tail, hopefully accidentally, that she would meow or yelp. There are lots of other ways that we could get Sophie to meow, but certainly stepping on her tail is a sufficient condition. Here's another example. Having COVID-19 is a sufficient condition for being ill, right? Now, hopefully none of you have had it or will get it. We certainly don't want anybody to be ill, but that is a sufficient condition for becoming ill. Obviously, there are lots of other ways for people to be medically ill, but having COVID-19 is a sufficient condition. Or another example, burning leaves is a sufficient condition for producing smoke. There are lots of other ways that we can produce smoke, but certainly burning leaves is a sufficient condition for producing smoke. So hopefully you can start to see this important distinction between something that's a condition that's necessary versus a condition that is sufficient. And we'll need this distinction, not just in epistemology, but in other philosophical debates and contexts as well. Okay, so here's a few more examples just to hopefully make this as clear as I can in a short amount of time. So being a tiger is a sufficient condition for being an animal. So obviously there are lots of other examples that we could point to that would also qualify as an animal other than just tigers. But being an animal is a necessary condition for being a tiger, right? Because that would mean you would have a non-tiger animal, which we don't think exists by definition. Drinking water is a sufficient condition for quenching thirst, right? Because I could drink Gatorade or apple juice, but certainly drinking water would be, we think, sufficient for quenching one's thirst. Having a racket is a necessary condition for playing tennis, because if I don't bring my racket, then I can't play tennis. I already mentioned the burning leaves example. Breathing oxygen is necessary for living. Having the flu is a sufficient condition for feeling miserable. And some can be both. So here's a good example of something that's both necessary and sufficient. Being enrolled in this course is a necessary and sufficient condition for receiving a grade. Why do we say that? Well, if we look at it from both angles, if you want to receive a grade, then you need to be enrolled, right? And then conversely, if you're enrolled by the end of the quarter, you will receive a grade, right? Whether you participated throughout the whole quarter or not, hopefully you do. But if you're enrolled by the end of the quarter, then you will receive a grade. And also, if you want to receive a grade, then you need to be enrolled. So being enrolled is both a necessary and sufficient condition for receiving a grade for our course. Another simple example, South Seattle College will raise tuition if and only if Green River College does. So that means if South Seattle College raises tuition, then Green River College does. And if Green River College raises tuition, then South Seattle College will. So anytime we use statements in English like if and only if, we're talking about something that's both a necessary and a sufficient condition. Okay, so let's talk about section 2, knowledge as the justified true belief account. This has been a very influential account that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks as well as other philosophers from around the world. And it's been very influential because it seems to make a lot of sense to a lot of people for understandable reasons. So according to this account of knowledge, to know something is the case, we have to believe it. And why do we say that? Well, one must believe it, which is some kind of propositional attitude. A proposition one does not even believe in cannot be a proposition that one knows. Therefore, knowledge at least requires belief. So if we take something that I think I know, for example, my age, I would have to believe that I'm actually that old in order to claim to know it. That seems to make a lot of sense, because why would we claim to know something that we don't actually believe? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So we think that having a belief about something is a necessary condition for knowing it, right? The second condition on the JTB account is truth, or T. That belief must actually be true. So that truth, we think, or most of us think, is independent of what one believes. It's objective. So in other words, this would rule out false propositions from knowledge. It's not like we know false things. We know that something is false, but in terms of an example like the Earth is the third planet from the sun, in order to know it, it actually has to be true, right? It actually has to be true that Earth is the third planet from the sun, and I have to believe it. So we've got two conditions. Therefore, knowledge requires truth, most people think. And then thirdly, justification, or the J part. So we think one must be justified in believing it. It cannot be a matter of luck. So for example, if I'm taking a quiz or a test on astronomy or the solar system, and I randomly guess that Earth is the third planet from the sun, a lot of people think, well, Anthony, you don't really know it. You just guessed. So it's not like you actually know that Earth is the third planet from the sun. If I randomly picked Earth from the 8 or 9 planets, we think one needs good reasons or evidence to hold that true belief. So there's been much debate about what counts as sufficient justification. Some use the term warrant. So I'm warranted in believing that Earth is the third planet from the sun, to refer to this sense of justification. But suffice it to say, this account, the JTB account, has been very influential for good reason. I mean, it's very intuitive. People think that this separates knowledge from non-knowledge, right? Mere opinion, or just some belief that you don't have knowledge in. This seems to require 3 things that many people think intuitively are required to say that we know something. Okay, so there's a lot of really good examples. I'm gonna skip this video, but I really encourage you to watch this video. I'll post the example to Canvas. Sorry for the video playing automatically, but there's a lot of great media on what we'll talk about next. And this has been considered from the 20th century the most influential attack or critique of the JTB account. And this is Edmund Gettier, well-known philosopher from the mid to latter part of the 20th century. And he wrote a very short but highly influential paper where he gave us examples of things, of pieces of knowledge that satisfy the JTB account, but we might think, oh, that person doesn't actually know it. So he gave us what are called counterexamples that satisfy the JTB account, but don't actually yield knowledge. So Edmund Gettier's objection to the JTB account of knowledge goes something like this. So we can put it into modus tollens. We can explicate or present this argument in modus tollens, which we learned about in logic. So premise one, if the JTB account can provide sufficient conditions for knowledge, then it should account for various counterexamples. Premise two, the JTB account cannot account for various counterexamples that Gettier is going to give us. Conclusion, therefore, the JTB account does not provide sufficient conditions for knowledge. So Gettier's approach is this. This is a quote. I shall argue that this account, the JTB account, is false in that the conditions stated therein do not constitute a sufficient condition for the truth of the proposition that S knows that P. How does he do that? Well, he gives two counterexamples or cases that seem to show that we can satisfy the conditions of the JTB account, as I said, but say that S does not know that P. So the cases are sometimes a little hard to understand. That's, again, why I recommend the videos for further explication. And I'll give another example here, or reframe it from the reading, which I think is a really good example of a Gettier case. So the first case that he gives is this case called Jones. So imagine Jones and Smith are going for a job. And so he's setting up this case where Jones is this guy or man who is lined up to get a job. And Jones has 10 coins in his pocket, okay? So why does this matter? Well, this entails that the man who will get the job, further suppose that we know, has 10 coins in his pocket, okay? But then it turns out, for whatever reason, that Smith figures out that he and not Jones will get the job, okay? So the three propositions are true. E is true, so it's true that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith believes that E is true, satisfying the that part of the JTB account, and Smith is justified in believing that E is true. So what we have here is a case where all three of the JTB conditions are satisfied, but it seems like we don't want to say that Smith knows that E is true. So we have a problem here with the JTB account, Gettier says. So surely Smith does not know that it's true, for it is only true in virtue of the number of coins in Smith's pocket. So in other words, it seems like Smith here doesn't know it because it just accidentally happens to be the case that the number of coins in Smith's pocket is 10. Okay, so this should remind you of the Earth being the third planet from the sun example. That's why we say that it can't just be accidental knowledge. There's no such thing. You actually have to know it and have justification for it. So let me give the example from the reading. So let's say I'm walking to campus. It's post-COVID, and I have a class every day at noon, 12 noon. Okay, but unbeknownst to me, the night before class, let's say Sunday night, the power goes out. And I don't know that, and nobody tells me before noon. So I show up to campus, and the clock stopped last night at 11:57 p.m. Okay, so the clock is stuck at 11:57. All right, and let's say I get to campus, and I usually get to campus around the same time, and I look up at the clock, and let's say it just so happens that it's 11:57 a.m. Okay, but the clock has been stuck at 11:57 since last night. So in that case, it's actually 11:57. I believe it's 11:57, and I'm justified in believing it because I'm looking at the clock and it says 11:57, but the clock's broken, right? That's why we often say even a broken clock is right twice in one day. So I think I've satisfied the JTB account. I'm justified. It's actually true, and I believe it. But it's only the case that it's 11:57 because it's been stuck there, and I don't know that the clock is broken. So I seem in that case to have another Gettier example. I've satisfied the JTB account, but it seems like most of us want to say Anthony doesn't know that it's 11:57 because even though it is incidentally 11:57, the clock's broken. I just so happen to be looking up at the clock at exactly 11:57 a.m., even though that clock is broken. So hopefully that case makes a lot of sense. I think it's really interesting, and it gets us thinking about, all right, well, what does it really mean to say that Anthony knows that it's 3 minutes before his class, or that Anthony knows that it's 11:57 in the morning? So that's really what the Gettier problem and these Gettier cases are really about. So here's the second case. This is Jones and the Ford example. So let's say we have the proposition that Jones owns a Ford truck, car, whatever. That entails these other three conditions: that G, either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Boston; H, either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona; and J, either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in some city, okay? But we have another Gettier case because these other two things hold. Jones, in fact, does not own a Ford at present, but is driving a rental car. And unknown to Smith, Brown just happens to accidentally be in Barcelona. But if these are true, Smith does not know that H is true, even though H is actually true. Smith does believe that H is true. And 3, Smith is justified in believing that H is true. So you don't have to understand all the intricacies of these cases to know that there are these examples or cases that we can think of, like with Anthony going to campus, where all 3 of the conditions for JTB, the JTB account, are satisfied, but it seems like we want to say that Anthony doesn't know it, or in this case, that Smith or Jones doesn't know that something is the case. So we can satisfy the JTB account, but still not have knowledge, according to Gettier, that the JTB account does not provide sufficient conditions for knowledge. Okay, so what does this show? Just to summarize, these 2 examples show that, according to Gettier, the JTB account does not provide a sufficient condition for knowledge. And ever since Gettier published this paper, philosophers, epistemologists in particular, have been very preoccupied with what it means to have knowledge. Some have tried to repair the JTB account. Others have said this is enough to show that we need something else other than the JTB account for knowledge. Still others think that any account that tries to identify necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge are doomed to fail and shouldn't be the basis for discussions of knowledge at all. And then this leads us and other epistemologists to consider alternatives. Buddhism and feminism have other conditions for knowledge, and there'll be some material that we can dive into about how they think of knowledge and how they think of knowledge differently than the historical JTB account. So there's been a lot of talk, especially with the rise of modern psychology, about what it really means to have knowledge. And we've gotten a much more diverse response to that question ever since Gettier. Okay, so what are some of those solutions? Well, we'll just talk about a few of them. One solution is to just amend the JTB account, is to say, well, we like the justified true belief, but we need to add something, call it X, and we'll call it the no false belief condition, because if we add that, then we can rescue the JTB account. Well, what is X? X is, if R is part of the subject S's reasons for believing that P, then R must be true. And if we add that, then we can avoid the Gettier style cases. So if we apply it to the first Gettier example, Smith's justification depends on the false belief that Jones got the job. So if we add that condition, then we can say that there is knowledge in that first Gettier case, and thus we can evade Gettier's point. But then a lot of other people can respond to this and say there are other Gettier type examples that challenge this condition. And so then philosophers, epistemologists, and psychologists go back and say, here's why this works, or here's why this doesn't work. Some epistemologists have tried to add what's called the indefeasibility condition. And what is that? Well, it just means there is no other truth, call it Q, such that believing that Q would have defeated the subject's justification for believing that P. So there can't be anything out there that, if it were true, would defeat your reason for having knowledge about that thing, okay? So this seems to be trivially true, since the information that one is in a Gettier type situation would definitely defeat one's justification for believing that P. So go back to the clock tower example. Proponents of this solution say, well, there can't be a defeater like the broken clock. So in that case, if we add this condition, many people would say, well, Anthony doesn't really know that it's 11:57 because it turns out the clock is broken. So not only does Anthony have to be justified, it has to be true and he has to believe it, there can't be a defeater like the clock's broken that would actually invalidate Anthony's claim to have knowledge that it's 11:57 in the morning. So a lot of people like conditions like this. There can't be any defeaters for some piece of potential knowledge. Like it can't be the case that, right, Earth isn't actually the third planet from the sun if I claim to have knowledge that Earth is the third planet from the sun. So there can't be any defeaters if I'm to claim to have knowledge about something. All right. Yeah, so some people disagree on whether or not this actually evades the Gettier problem. Some people say that this is equivalent to defining the fourth condition as provided that this case is not a Gettier case, which seems a little ad hoc, right? To say, well, we can avoid Gettier cases if we add the condition that this isn't a Gettier case, which seems a little slippery, right? But we'll set aside that interesting addition for now. A lot of people like the causation account or response to the Gettier case. So what this is some condition like S knows that P if and only if the fact that P caused S to believe P. So if we apply it to a Gettier example, it would be something like believing the initial proposition does not cause belief in the entailed propositions. So for example, if we take the simple example of the Earth being the third planet from the sun, we might say, well, we add this causation factor that, well, the reason that Anthony has knowledge of it is because the fact that Earth is the third planet from the sun is causing Anthony to believe that that's the case, right? So a lot of people like this, adding this causation requirement that there has to be some kind of ultimate cause that causes us to have the true belief. Or for the clock example, it actually has to be a working clock to cause Anthony to have the justified true belief about the time of day that it is. Now, not everybody is satisfied with this amendment. This theory also has potential problems of its own. It may not make sense for mathematical knowledge, such that 2 + 2 = 4, because it's kind of bizarre to say that math causes beliefs, right? Or knowledge of certain other analytic truths, such as that all bachelors are unmarried. Some things just seem to be true by definition without any causation being apparent. So there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not this is a satisfactory response to the Gettier problem. Okay, so let's talk just briefly about justification, or sometimes called warrant. So the two most prominent responses to what counts as sufficient justification are one, internalism, which is a very well-known view within epistemology that talks about how we're motivated by internal mental states. So don't let this word be unnecessarily daunting to you. Internalism just means when we claim to have knowledge, where is the knowledge ultimately? we think, well, it's inside, it's internal to your mind or your brain, to your mental states, right? If I have knowledge about my age or about the order of the planets, those are beliefs that are internal to me, right? So that's internalism. And according to internalism, we maintain that when we know something, we are aware of the reason or reasons that it's true. So if I'm thinking about why Earth is the third planet, I think about, right, grade school, astronomy class, things like that. I'm aware of the reason or reasons that I think that that's true. So warrant in this case must be a relation to some other mental state, some other thing that's internal in Anthony's mind. So how can an internalist distinguish knowledge from other mental states like beliefs or desires or hopes or wonders or doubts, etc.? Well, usually internalists say that we have to distinguish knowledge based on things inside the mind, right? There's something about knowledge that's distinct from these other things, right? There's something unique about knowledge that separates it from these other kinds of mental phenomena, right? The character of the mental state itself and its relation to the other mental states is different when we're talking about knowledge than when we're talking about things like beliefs or hopes, right? There's something uniquely different about those mental states that knowledge captures versus not knowledge. Okay, so there is some problems with internalist accounts of justification. One of the most major criticisms is what's called the infinite regress problem. So let's take, again, the simple example of Anthony knows that Earth is the third planet from the sun. Well, why do I know that? Well, I can refer to me learning it when I was younger. And then if I go back before that, I've got some other reason. And then I go back and go back and go back. And then I've gone into an infinite regress of justification. So maybe this reminds you of maybe when you were a kid, if you were like me, you asked your parents something like, why is the sky blue? And then maybe they try to give you an answer. And then you would say, why? And then you just kept asking why over and over and over again. That's the infinite regress problem, right? And a lot of people think that problem is there for any claim to knowledge that we have, right? That we can just go back and back and back infinitely, and we'll never get out of that infinite regress. Maybe we can stop it by a view called foundationalism, and this will lead into the infamous René Descartes. So a lot of philosophers argue that the way we get out of this infinite regress is to talk about some basic beliefs that cannot be questioned, that they're just there, they're basic. We can't ask why they're there, they're there. So this is a view called foundationalism, that there's a foundation of basic beliefs that we have as humans that form the foundation for all other knowledge. So such knowledge is self-evident or self-justifying truths, which we know directly and aren't dependent on any other belief. Some people will argue for a view known as coherentism, which means essentially that, well, as long as your overall holistic or interdependent system of beliefs coheres with itself, is coherent, then we'll be fine. So coherentism is a different approach than foundationalism. Foundationalism is the view that, again, there are basic beliefs that underlie all of our other beliefs. Some people don't like this approach. They take the coherentist approach. They think, well, as long as your whole holistic interweb of beliefs are coherent, then you're fine. You don't need to have a handful of basic beliefs from which to base the rest of your knowledge on. So if you're a coherentist, you don't think that beliefs are self-evident or self-justifying. Nothing is known directly or independent of any other belief. So foundationalism is a distinct view from coherentism. So these are two different solutions out of the infinite regress problem of justification. Okay, the other view opposed to internalism is externalism. So maybe you think it's not really about what's internal to your mind, but that beliefs that match up with what's out there in the external world. A lot of people like that. So if we talk about the Earth being the third planet from the sun example, then a lot of people want to say, well, Anthony knows it, just in case external to Anthony's mind, there is a planet out there, right? Earth, that is actually the third planet. So externalism is an approach to epistemology that says roughly that we're motivated by the fact that truth is external. It's the external connection of a mental state to the world outside of the mind. Okay, there actually has to be a truth out there in the world, the objective world, that matches up with my mental state. And externalism maintains that when we know something, the only thing that matters is that it matches the way the world actually is. In other words, it's in the right relation to the truth. So that's why we draw the arrows this way, right? Belief is justified externally, right? It's not just my mental state in Anthony's mind. It's matches up with what's out there, okay? So warrant or justification must be a matter of how a belief arose. There actually has to be a thing out there that is causing or gives rise to my knowledge that it's the case. So how can an externalist distinguish knowledge from other mental states? Well, we can distinguish knowledge based on the relations between the mental state or states and the world. So it must be formed by a reliable belief-forming process, which need not be accessible to the knower, but needs to be there. There has to be some relation between the external world and our mind in a way that gives us knowledge. Are there problems with externalism? Yes, there are. So one issue that comes up is what we call reliabilism. And this is the issue of justification is accomplished if and only if a belief originates in reliable cognitive processes or faculties. Okay, so this is one approach to externalism. But then we can always ask, well, how do I know that the source of knowledge is reliable? How do I know that my knowledge comes from reliable processes? How do we know that? That's one question. Well, we might be back at the infinite regress problem, right? Because I can just keep asking why questions for eternity, right? So this is going to come down to where we think knowledge comes from. Is it from perception? Is it from inference? Is it from some other process, right? So knowledge is justified potentially only if we know we are using the appropriate source, or only if we get knowledge from the right source. But what could be the appropriate source of knowledge, right? So hopefully you're seeing how each answer we propose opens up a whole host of other interesting and thought-provoking philosophical questions, right? So these problems continue, and this is what epistemologists and psychologists are wrestling with to this day. So let me leave it there. I'm going to stop this lecture here because I know I've already gone over a lot of terms, but please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll pick up in the next lecture from where we left off here. Thanks for listening.